Hi, I'm Fiona and I'm from St Joseph's Church in Benwell, Newcastle. And I am going to talk today about hope, about a better hope. And if I were to ask you right now, what are you hoping for? What would you say? What would be the first words to come out of your mouth? As I've been preparing for this talk, I've realised how often I say those three words. I hope that. I hope that it doesn't rain. I hope I lock the back door and turn the oven off. I hope I can cope with being stuck in the house a lot. I hope we don't get COVID or long COVID or worse. Oh, I hope we can see the family at Christmas. I hope things will be better in the spring. We are creatures of hope, aren't we? In fact, we thrive on having something to look forward to, whether it's a party, whatever that is, a holiday, a reunion. We're hardwired to hope. And that's one of the reasons why 2020 has been such a difficult year for so many of us, because our hopes are suddenly very uncertain. Many of the things that we hope for are thrown up in the air, whether it's the job, the relationship, the good health, the family, the happiness. It's uncertain. Maybe we've even found ourselves running out of hope when dream after dream just disappears. You might have found yourself asking, what can I hold on to in life? What is there in life that is certain? I used to be a maths teacher, and one of the things that I used to teach was probability. And I used to draw a line on the board and at one end put impossible and at the other end put certain. And I would say things like, what are the chances that if I toss a coin up in the air, it's going to land on tails? And they would have to put it at the right place on the board. And I would say things like, what are the chances that pigs can fly? And they would say, well, impossible. Except for one awkward child who would say, well, I'm going to Spain at half term, and if I stole a pig and put it into my suitcase, then technically on the plane, pigs could fly. But I would move on and I would say, okay, so what's the chances that if I drop this ball, it's going to fall to the ground? And they would say, well, because of gravity, that's certain. Except for one awkward child who would say, well, it's not technically speaking certain because Johnny's on the cricket team and he's really good at catching, he's really quick. So if he caught it before it fell to the ground, it wouldn't be certain. And I would say, okay, all right, so maybe slightly less than certain. But there was one event that no one would argue with. I would say, what's the chance that someday we will die? Certain. No arguments there, because it's undeniable. Now you might be thinking, well, that's not the kind of certainty that I want. That's not even something I like to think about. In fact, we spend a lot of our lives living in denial about death. We try and delay that it happens. We touch up our photos, we dye our hair, we try and work on our bodies. We try and deny the whole aging process. It even feels a bit kind of taboo to talk about it because we're in denial about it a lot of the time. Or we fight it. Peter Thiel, who is the co-founder of PayPal and a billionaire, he's aiming to live till 120 through regenerative medicine. He plans to be cryogenically frozen one day and then reanimated when the science allows. He says about death, you can accept it, you can deny it, or you can fight it. I think our society is dominated by people who are into denial or acceptance, but I prefer to fight it. He's saying, we know it happens, but let's try and beat it back as far as we can. And that's been what a lot of this year's been about for so much of the world, hasn't it? Stay at home, wash your hands, don't see your family, don't gather, stop the virus, keep the death toll down, fight it. And why wouldn't you? Because even when we do try to accept death as just part of the circle of life, We tell ourselves that it's a natural part of the animal kingdom and we will fertilize the ground for new growth. It just doesn't sit right with us. We lose a precious family member or a loved one, and our experience isn't, well, that's just the way it is. We miss them and we mourn for them, and we have a deep sense of, that's wrong. It's not the way that it should be. The other day, a family near Oxford were driving down the A40 when they crashed into a lorry. The mum and her 3 children died, and the dad has been left critically injured. No one from their village is saying, oh, it's just part of life. They are shocked and they're saddened and they're struggling to process what has happened because it just feels wrong, like they have been cheated out of life. My own dad died 3 years ago, and even though he was 81 and so a good old age, you could say, it still felt like a punch in the guts because he was a unique, precious, irreplaceable person. How can he just cease to exist? Death feels like it's an imposter that's broken into our world and is stealing people away from us. So what are we to do with this impossible enemy when he wins every time? How can we have any hope? Well, there is hope, and it can be found in another account of a parent who lost her family, this time a mum. She had already lost her husband when her only son tragically died as well. She had had to bury all the members of her family. Now, she lived in a country in a time where there was no welfare state, there was no universal credit, no winter fuel allowance, no state pension. If you were a widow on your own with no income, the only option was to beg on the streets. So as she watched her son's body being carried down the street, she also watched her security, her family, and her hope being carried away. Until a man saw her. He saw her hopelessness and her grief and her despair, and his heart went out to her. And he went up to her and he said, "Don't cry." Don't cry? Good advice, eh? Surely weeping was the only thing to do right then. Unless the person who is speaking is Jesus, and he can reverse the reason for the tears. And he does this by going up to the coffin where the young man is lying. And he gets the coffin bearers to stop. And he says to the dead body, "Young man, get up." And the man wakes up, sits up, and Jesus gives him back to his mum. Jesus takes the widow's hopelessness and he boomerangs it in the other direction by giving her family, security, love, joy, laughter again. You can read about this for yourself in chapter 7 of a book of the Bible written by a guy called Luke. Now at this point you could well be thinking, well, nice story, but really? That's the hope for the 21st century? What has a fairy story from a book that's been written 2,000 years ago got to do with me? It's 1,000,000 miles away from where I'm at. Well, what if this isn't a fairy story, but it was a historical event? What if Luke, who wrote about this, was a historian who used eyewitness accounts? What if there is evidence that Jesus not only did this miracle, but he beat death himself by coming back to life, having been executed on a cross 3 days earlier? A couple of years after becoming a Christian, I started to seriously wonder if there was any truth in Christianity. I mean, was the whole God thing just in my head? Was it like a nice kind of comfort blanket, but at the end of the day, it was just true for me and there was no objective certainty in it? I was doing history A-level at the time, and I got to choose my own research project. So I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll research if Jesus rose from the dead or not. I'll find out for myself if it's more than just a fairy story. So I went up to my history teacher and I told him my great idea, to which he laughed in my face. Not an encouraging start, but he didn't actually stop me. So I delved into the historical reliability of the documents and the evidence surrounding Jesus' resurrection. And what I discovered was it's one of the best documented historical events of the time. So much so that even atheists that have sought to disprove the resurrection have become Christians based on the strength of the evidence. So, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that when Jesus says totally outrageous things like, I am the resurrection and the life, the one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Maybe we shouldn't dismiss that. If you're driving in a car at 60 miles an hour and you can't see out the windows, that's scary. You don't know what's coming and you don't know where you're going. In the same way, if you are driving towards death without the ability to see what's coming, that's going to make us afraid. But what if the driver is Jesus and he can not only see where he's going, but he knows what's coming? What if by trusting Jesus to be in charge, we can travel through death to an infinitely better life? Now again, you might be thinking at this point, a better life? Really? Floating around with a halo on my head, looking a bit bling? I mean, that sounds more boring than lockdown. But that is not the picture of heaven that Jesus paints. Just like Jesus mended what was broken in the widow's life, he promises in heaven to mend what is broken in our lives. Our fractured relationships with people will be mended. Our fragile health will be restored. Our pain and loss at losing loved ones will be banished forever. When Jesus talked of heaven, he talked about a party, he talked about a feast, he talked about a celebration where we can see God and we can know God and we can enjoy God without any more fear. He promises to those who put him in the driving seat of their lives to bring reunion, love, security, laughter, joy, and celebration, just like he did for that widow, only infinitely more. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Could this be the certainty that we can put our hope in? That is something that is definitely worth thinking about. Thanks for listening.